The 19th Amendment, ratified back in 1920, was mostly a victory for white women. It left many women of color still fighting for the right to vote. NBC News correspondent Trymaine Lee joins us now to discuss his latest Into America podcast. This one is Into Black Women and the 19th Amendment. Trymaine, tell us about this conversation that you had in your new podcast.
Thanks for having me, Allison. So I spoke with Martha Jones, who is an historian and professor at Johns Hopkins University, who has a new book about black women really being the vanguard of the voting rights movement and the suffrage movement for women. You know, sometimes we think back to, Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton as the mothers of feminism and the suffrage movement. But there is a glaring omission, not just of the black women like Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, or Geraldine Lee, who pushed the agenda of voting for all women, but they were actually racist. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in the lead up to the 15th Amendment, which would have given, which gave the right to vote to all men, including black men, she described black men as little more than rapists who would degrade white women if given the right to vote. Obviously, to the great applause and enthusiasm of the Klan and other racists in this country. But again, this conversation with Martha Jones on Into America was a really good conversation that really made them, black women, invisible no more. Let's take a listen.
There are a record number of black women running for Congress in 2020. Biden had 6 black women on his short list. Ultimately, he selects Senator Kamala Harris as the first black woman on a major party ticket. What's the significance of all this? Is this just the culmination of all that work over the last 100+ years? What does this moment mean?
I think it is a culmination. In my book, it's a culmination really of 200 years, which is to say black women have been at this a very long time. And this is, Kamala Harris does not drop from the heavens, right? She grows out of black women's politics across many generations. And when you look at a figure like Senator Harris or Representative Ayanna Pressley or Leader Stacey Abrams, these are women, when you ask them, they will tell you, I come out of a political tradition. And it's not the political tradition exemplified by Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Alice Paul at all. It is a political tradition that these women will tell you easily comes out of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, Mary McLeod Bethune, Ida B. Wells, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan. Black women understand their own political history and how we come to be where we are in 2020.
As Martha Jones so eloquently said right there, as is the same in the case with most freedom struggles and the right for votes, there's a continuum here from those black women who fought against societal pressure and racism, even among the ranks of the other suffragettes, that there's a clear line from then to what we see now. Allison?
The history is just absolutely incredible. Trymaine, we know that the fight for racial justice is far from over, even in 2020. What are some of the other issues that came up in your conversation?
You know, mostly about the ongoing push for voting rights. You think about the long lines we've seen in recent elections, other voter suppression efforts like voter ID and continue, issues like that. And we continue to see black women pushing the boundaries. Let's not forget that they are the most loyal voting bloc to the Democratic Party. And so when we think about 2020, this high stakes election, we talked a lot about just the groundwork that had been laid so long ago, continuing to reverberate today, especially in the power and force that are black female voters.
He's a podcast host. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. I just love saying that. Trymaine Lee, thanks so much for coming back on and being with us.
Thank you as always, Dawson. I appreciate it.
And you can download and listen to the full Into America episode, Into Black Women and the 19th Amendment, wherever you get your podcasts.
It's one of the longest, toughest civil rights battles in our history, which involves half of the citizens of the nation. It's usually portrayed as women asked for the vote at Seneca Falls in 1848. Then it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And no one else was involved. And then in 1920, they were given the vote. And all of that is, of course, completely false.
African American women are present, some of them very prominent women like Sojourner Truth, and those women speak to a different political philosophy because African American women are the embodiment of both, if you will, blackness and womanhood.
There's millions of women involved in this, and men who supported suffrage for women. The constitutional amendment, what we call 19th Amendment, finally is passed by a very narrow margin, goes to the states for ratification. That's the crucial last step. 3/4 of the states in the Union have to approve this, and that means 36 states. And by the summer of 1920, 35 have ratified. They only need one more.
Well, Tennessee was out of session, so their governor, Albert Roberts, called the legislature back into special session in August of 1920.
The women and the men are wearing yellow roses to signify their support for ratification of the 19th Amendment. The opposition, the anti-suffragists, both men and women, are wearing red roses. It really meant they did not want equality for women, and they certainly did not want Black women to vote.
And this is not a secret. In 1919 and 1920, Black women threatened to tip the balance of political power.
And it does come down to a vote of conscience by the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, 24-year-old man named Harry Byrne.
Harry, this article says that you are the father of women's suffrage. What is that all about?
Well, that's the first time I've ever been so designated. It's the first time I've ever heard the words expressed in that particular manner.
Harry T. Byrne was my great-granduncle, leaves his home in Iota to go back to Nashville for this session, planning to vote for the amendment.
I had left Iota, my farm, and where my mother lived, to going to Nashville planning to vote for women's suffrage. But after I got over there, my political advisors, the elderly statesmen in McMinn County, suggested we ought to let it go over.
He's worried about his re-election chances. So he starts to kind of side with the anti-suffragists. He's wearing a red rose.
He knows his constituents are not going to be happy. He knows his mentor is not going to be happy. And yet he changes his mind because that morning he has gotten a letter from his mother.
I think Feb Byrne has a fascinating story. She's a successful farm manager, and a lot of her farm hands, a lot of them couldn't even read. They were illiterate, yet they were voting, and she couldn't. So she writes the letter, and it arrives on the morning of August 18th. On page 2, she says, "Hoorah, vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt." And that's when Harry realizes, without me, this amendment's going to die. Tennessee's going to reject it. So I'm going to follow my conscience, follow my mother's advice. And he casts a yes vote on that roll call, making it 49-47, breaking the tie, and making Tennessee the perfect 36th state required to ratify this amendment.
Are you happy now that...
Yes, I've been asked that question 10,000 times, and I've always been glad to answer yes. I've always been glad I did.
It didn't end in 1920. We can commemorate this wonderful anniversary, but it's not the end of the story.
Many American women can't vote after 1920. What Black women know is that no 19th Amendment will get to them to the polls if intimidation and violence continue to be the order of the day in the American South. We have voter ID requirements. We have the shuttering of polling places. We have the purging of voter rolls. All those things mean that once again, we're in an era of voter suppression that has the disproportionate effect of disenfranchising voters of color.
We have to realize that we're in another period where voting rights are threatened, where our democracy, the sort of foundation of our democracy, is threatened. So I think there are some really critical, important questions today that harken back to the suffrage movement and tell us that this fight is just never over.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.